My topic this afternoon is rather ambitiously called Power in Washington. I'm reminded that Mrs. Henry Adams once said about Henry James, the trouble with Henry James is not that he bites off more than he can chew, but that he chews more than he bites off. I hope not to be guilty of that shortcoming this afternoon. I'm planning to bite off a fairly large subject, and how well I can chew it remains to be seen. But it did seem to me that it was time to revisit the problem of power in Washington. Back in 1964, before going to the White House, I wrote a book with that rather arrogant title. And indeed, as a journalist who had been covering Washington for a good many years, I thought I knew all about it. A funny thing happens to a journalist on the way to the White House. He loses some of his certitudes. But I did, in the book, do some things that I still think were useful. I tried to re-examine some of the theories about how power is organized in the nation's capital. It seemed to me as a working journalist that for too many years we had been accepting rather casually the theory that was probably first developed by Woodrow Wilson, which what I would simplify by calling the seesaw theory of power in Washington, that power, the center of power, was a seesaw mechanism that moved from one end to the other of Pennsylvania Avenue. It was either located in the presidency or it was located in Congress. And Wilson wrote his book on congressional government, in which he concluded that the center of power was in Congress, and then he later wrote his book before he became president on presidential government, in which he concluded that if a president really willed it, that the center of power could be shifted to the White House. And the theories of Wilson were taken up and extended by Walter Lippmann's various writings, and became a part of the conventional wisdom of the power tilt in Washington. And after I had been there enough years, it suddenly occurred to me that this was really not a terribly useful kind of metaphor for examining power in Washington, and that it really had become in modern government a bit more complicated than that. That the main set of power tensions that I could detect as I followed one story after another was the tension between what might be called the integrating and the unifying forces in government and the forces of diversity. And then gradually I began to construct in my own mind a theory of what might be called the emergence of sub-governments. That these represented the effective challenge to presidential power in the actual workings of the power struggle in Washington. A sub-government could not be simply defined as a lobby. A sub-government usually combined elements of the executive, the legislative, and the interest groups, that it was a neat arrangement of forces. A sub-government was not as unified as a lobby. Frequently there was diversity of interests within a sub-government. But that the main motivating impulse of a sub-government was to set its own priorities within a specified sphere. In my book, Power in Washington, I examined in particular two sub-governments, one on a microcosm level because it represented such a neat example, was the sub-government of sugar, a neat ordering of power that combined forces in the Department of Agriculture, in the agricultural committees of Congress, and in the interest groups, both domestic and foreign, to arrange what was in effect a rather tidy little cartel in the sugar economy. And that was almost too neat a sub-government to be very useful as a form of analysis, and so then I took at the opposite extreme what is called the defense industrial complex, which is a vast sub-government made up of many conflicting interests and lobby groups and a diversity of forces within it, but still which could be called a sub-government because it was so constituted that it was capable of setting priorities that could challenge the higher priorities of government. Now, in trying to describe these sub-governments, I was not applying immediately a highly a value judgment. It seems to me we're too quick frequently in politics to describe something and immediately say right or wrong. And there was something, and as government became big and complex, as it became an ongoing operation that required daily decision making, there was something quite logical in the evolution of sub-governments. The problem comes when the sub-government challenges the larger conduct of government. In the case of the sugar sub-government, this came to become very clear in the time that when Cuba went communist, and the allotments given to sugar allotments to Cuba had to be restructured, and the sub-government made decisions about this, including a healthy quota to the Dominican Republic that was then under Trujillo, that ran into direct conflict with the foreign policy of the United States government. And for a time, for a period of nearly 2 years, it was a good question in Washington whether the foreign policy of the sub-government of sugar was going to override the foreign policy of the government of the United States. And it's then that a sub-government does become a worrisome instrument for the ordering of power. In the same way, the sub-government of defense, I don't need to say, has caused a great many concerns over the years that it sets priorities for the allocation of the national budget. It sets priorities for the activities of government and of the economy, which are not necessarily the priorities that a well-integrated government, national government of the United States would set if the sub-government did not have the force and power and skill and cunning that it has. Well, with the growth of this kind of challenge to central leadership, I don't think it's been surprising that the presidency has become of necessity the instrument for trying to set the higher priorities of government, and that there is no institution of national government that has evolved more radically since World War II than the presidency of the United States. And I remember that in the Eisenhower years, when at last a degree of bureaucratic order was brought to the presidency, that there was a great deal of public and press deification of how important that it was that the presidency had become this bureaucratic institution for establishing order. But then in the latter Eisenhower years, we witnessed the challenge to the Eisenhower concept of the ordering of the presidency. The book was published by Richard Neustadt on Presidential Power, the Politics of Leadership, which was essentially a modern Machiavelli challenge that the concept of the conduct of the presidency was not adequate to the needs of power in Washington. And Neustadt came out with the definition of the need for a shrewd and self-serving president who would be able to become the leader rather than the clerk in his own office. John F. Kennedy had read Neustadt's book, but as Neustadt once said, if he had never seen it, he would not have had to see it, that his instincts were those of the book. And both Kennedy and Johnson, coming from the political tradition they did, saw a need for the forcible assertion of a skillful man to bring together the presidential power in a way that it could get on top of modern government in Washington. Under Kennedy, if you remember the development of whether the defense industrial complex could be tamed. And Kennedy brought in the very skillful and able Secretary of Defense to try to get on top of the defense industrial complex. And for a period of years, there was in the intellectual community a glorification of the new theory of presidential power and presidential preeminence in the power structure of government. And yet in recent years there has been a growth, I think, in academia and in the press and in public opinion of a concern about the evolution of the modern president. There has been a equating of the growth of role of the modern president with a growth of power. And quite frequently you will read articles, columns by men like James Reston in the New York Times decrying the fact that the modern presidency has grown too powerful. And there are four major areas of growth in presidential power that are pointed to. One is presidential involvement. Today, after the Kennedy-Johnson years, is an accepted fact that no sparrow falls, but that a president is involved somehow in it. And a president does stand at the very center of things. He can't ignore what happens. Two, there has been the growth of the presidential office. It has become a sizable bureaucracy in its own right, bringing together all manner of expertise. Three, there has been the growth of the communication role of the president, both internal and external. The president has the capacity now, even in conduct of a war in Vietnam, of almost instant battlefield communication. A president with the age of television has the capacity to turn the nation into a kind of a Greek marketplace in which he presents his wisdom in the fireside of every home. And finally, there is the growth of what are called the push-button powers. A modern president has certain mysterious powers by which he can push a button and a hydrogen bomb will explode. And reviewing all of these areas of growth, it is possible to become extremely alarmed that so much power has been centered in a single man. But I think before we allow alarm to carry us too far or to prescribe too specific a course of rectification, that we do need to ask the question, power for what? The dictionary definition of power is that a marked ability to do or to act. And bearing that definition in mind, I think it's useful to examine each of the four principal areas of growth in the presidency and to look at what I would call the reverse or the perverse nature of power. First of all is this matter of involvement, that a president can ignore very little that happens in the nation or the world today. And yet the more I watched this power of the president, the more from inside the White House, the more it began to seem to me like the power of the switchboard operator on any large telephone exchange, that it's an awfully busy job, and it can be a very disruptive job if the operator is pulling the wrong switches and plugging in the wrong lines. But it's really a job that frequently is, the very busyness of it is preventing any kind of systematic use of power. Secondly, there is the power that accrues with the growth of the office, and certainly this is not to be minimized. A modern president, compared to an earlier president, has remarkable expertise at his command. The Council of Economic Advisors brings to him a whole set of intelligence reports that permit him to exercise power in the economic affairs of the nation. Bureau of the Budget has over the years developed into a first-class institution for permitting a president to keep on top of the diverse affairs of the government through the budget process. Office of Science and Technology and all the rest of the appendages of the executive office are useful power-accreting institutions in the modern presidency. And yet there too there is a perverse nature to it. The Council of Economic Advisors can tell a president how to maintain full employment in the economy, but it frequently illumines the inability of the president to command all the levers that would carry out what they recommend to him. The president, for example, has only the most marginal control over tax policy, which can frequently be the decisive in trying to maintain a high employment economy. The third area I mentioned is that of communications, and this is worthy of a whole afternoon of discussion, it seems to me, because I think that communications represents the most fundamental crisis confronting this country and indeed the world, and that it is particularly accentuated in the office of the president. First of all, it seems to me that there are three aspects of the perverse nature of the communication power. A president can communicate to the farthest parts of the world with a facility and a certainty that was lacking in earlier days. And yet here more than anywhere else, it seems to me, it tempts a president to extend himself beyond the human capacity to conduct his leadership. To regulate the bombing flights in a far-off part of the world gives a certain sense of confidence, because you are no longer dependent, as Lincoln was, on the erratic behavior of battlefield commanders. And at the same time, it puts the obligation on the president to be a superior battlefield commander. And this is a rather terrible strain on the whole business of presidential leadership. Secondly, the growth of communication has not been confined to the service of the president alone. All of us are the beneficiaries of instant and total communication, and it's quite frequently true that our amazing technological capacity in communication today is hustling the whole process of decision-making at a rate that is not healthy to decision-making. I would just call to your attention that suppose Kennedy had not had the advantage of almost a week between the time his intelligence brought to him the certainty of the missile sites in Cuba and the general public knowledge of that. He had a week to make wise policy in connection with that. If he had only had 10 minutes, or if he had known simultaneously, I think the possibility of unwise policy might have been much greater. This was brought home to me quite vividly the summer before last when I was watching on television the ghastly unfolding of the convention, the Democratic convention in Chicago. There was one point in an evening proceedings in which Carl Albert, the majority leader of the House, was presiding. Mr. Albert, whom I've known for many years, is a wise, thoughtful, and I think commendable leader. Yet that particular evening, trouble broke out in one of the delegations. I believe it was Wisconsin. It may have been California. And instantly, the television cameras focused in, and the television reporters were on the scene, and the nation as a whole knew precisely what the trouble was that was erupting on the floor. Whereas Mr. Albert, the leader, was standing at his podium and had no, as one could tell watching him, no knowledge of what was going on. And so he was caught in the problem of the leaders who has a communication gap of having to make decisions when other people knew more than he did. And this, to me, typified quite frequently the problem of presidential leadership when the communication system has become so able that so perfect that there is no time lag in which to that encourages thoughtful decision making. And one third aspect of the communication crisis that I would just touch on this afternoon, and I don't know what is the total explanation or what is the solution for it, but I think it's fitting to observe that no politician, certainly no president, has mastered television communication the way Roosevelt mastered radio communication. Television, despite its enormous potential for power accretion on the part of a president, really has not filled that role. And that in the fact that television has removed much of the mystique of presidential leadership. TV can be a short-term instrument for presidential persuasion. If a president is trying to sustain a veto in Congress, as Nixon did on the HEW, he can use it for a specified purpose. But as far as I can judge, for a longer-term development of confidence and sustaining support in presidential leadership, television has not been much of an instrument. There is the fourth area that I mentioned earlier in the growth of the presidency, and which is the push-button powers. And indeed, these are almost hypnotic in their capacity to create concern. One can linger too long on the possibility of an erratic or irrational president pushing a button and bringing the ultimate Holocaust, and it is there. But I think it's fitting to observe in a more day-to-day role that the push-button power of the president, as far as I've been able to observe it, represents that when he does resort to the push-button powers, it represents a failure of power. That really the only areas that he can effectively push buttons and accomplish immediate results are in areas in which he has no longer got the capacity to deal with it in an effective way. And it itself is not particularly a power accreting role in the presidency. Well, having said this, I think it's useful to consider where we stand today in terms of our notion of presidential power and its part in the power structure of Washington. I think we're in for a period of serious re-examination. I think this is a very healthy fact. I think the public has helped us bring this re-examination by creating another situation in which we have a president of one party and Congress of another. This is a perfect power situation for causing us to re-examine the fundamentals. As we re-examine power in Washington and how it should be appropriately exercised, seems to me I detect two quite contrary public sentiments. As never before, we have the mood in the land, we need to get things done. I don't think we have ever been in our nation's history more problem-oriented, and not only concerned but impatient that things need to be done and done quickly. And we're not talking about little problems, we're talking about fundamental problems of our society. the same time, we have as we have the get things done sentiment, we have the do your own thing sentiment, which is equally strong in the land. There is very little evidence that in getting things done that we are really all that serious about yielding up power to those who can get things done. As we discuss the role of Washington in dealing with things, and one thing I've heard quite frequently in meeting with classes this last 2 weeks here at UCLA is whether there doesn't need to be an increased role for Congress. Particularly, the question has been put to me in several seminars about whether Congress ought not to have a more active and effective role in foreign policy formulation. Simultaneously, I think there is a sentiment that is discernible in the university communities, but also elsewhere, that there needs to be diminished or at least divided role for the president. I was just reading this morning an article by my former colleague George Reedy, who was press secretary under Johnson, in the current issue of Look magazine. And Reedy, having pondered the problem for a year, just as I have, has now come up with his tentative conclusions. And he calls, and the title of the article is, I think, "We Need a King." Well, Reedy is not yearning for monarchy particularly, but he does want to divide the two roles of the president. He would like to have a titular head of government who maintains the necessary separation from the arena which a titular head usually has, and he wants a prime minister who is down in the hurly-burly and is still feeling the rub of political conflict. It's a very personal article. I commend it to your reading because it's got some really rather interesting insights about. Reedy was with Johnson many years, for a good many years, when he was in the Senate. He was the longest lived of the president's assistants. And what you detect in that article is a great sadness over what he felt happened to this able politician when he became president, and he blames it on the isolating role of the White House. As I say, I think Reedy's insights are valuable. I think his conclusions are useless. There is no way in the late 20th century, it seems to me, toward moving deliberately toward monarchy or even any variation thereof. If there is a isolating role that happens to presidents, and there is to an extent, it comes not from his titular role as head of state. It comes from the fact that this man is the exerciser of the principal power in our government, and that in the really incessant demand on him in that he necessarily becomes somewhat buffered. And I don't think there are any gimmicks by which you can change that. As we re-examine this ordering of power, what the role of the president should be, what the role of Congress should be, there are three factors that I'm trying to keep in mind as I ponder it and as I plan to write about it. And this talk is somewhere in mid-flight. I have not reached firm and positive conclusions. But as we look at what it is we mean by power, the marked capacity to act, and as we apply it to what we see that needs to be done with power, I think we need to be very concerned that we just don't lunge to do things differently from the way we have done them merely for the sake of change. First of all, look at the domestic side in the nation. As I mentioned earlier, we are concerned today with and we feel a concern, and it's deeply felt throughout the land, about problems that we've never felt before. And these are problems peculiarly without boundaries, without geographic boundaries. They cannot be confined to municipalities, to counties, to states. Our great and urgent need is how to create new institutions that are capable of dealing with these new kinds of problems, problems of our environment, problems of urban America. And these institutions have to be capable of sustaining themselves. One thing you learn, if you learn nothing else in working in Washington, is that merely to pass a law to deal with a problem is hardly the beginning. That unless you have created a political institution that's able to claim the priority and claim the resources to continue, the law is useless. And this is our dilemma in dealing with urban America and environmental America, is how to claim, how to establish the sub-government that has the muscle that can continue to operate effectively. Certainly, and this is my second point, in dealing with these new domestic problems, we need to explore better ways of exercising power than simply the office of the presidency. And yet, I would submit that I still feel strongly that the presidency has to be the energizing force by which we get these new institutions launched. I don't see where else in government the energy to launch them is going to come from. It's as true today as it was when our form of government was founded. And as you perhaps recall from the Federalist Papers, they examined then why we should have a unitary executive rather than a consular executive, and examining the checks and balances that had been built into the system, they felt that the prime requisite that the executive had to bring to government was energy, an energizing force, and that this could not be done by a council. And I think this continues to be true. I don't see any way to divide up the job of the presidency. And the third factor, as we look at the foreign policy field and say, well, surely there's a way to share or to tilt the power system in that area, again, I would raise some questions. I don't have the answers. Is it possible for Congress to really play a role in the formulation of foreign policy? And a more precise question I think we need to ask ourselves is, if Congress had played a more substantial role in the formulation of foreign policy in the case of Vietnam, would we be any better off today? We may have different answers to those questions, but at least I think they need to be seriously examined. I don't wish to conclude on a do-nothing or a Pollyannish note. I do believe very sincerely that government is in crisis. And I think we can all legitimately ask the question, can we continue to govern? The recent experience is not heartening. I think that for me, after serving 4.5 years in the White House, I have far more searching questions about government than I did before I went in. But I would at least conclude on this note that the way the system works now is enormously destructive of those involved in the governing process, not least of all to the presidents themselves. But the capacity to pin the responsibility and the blame on a single man and to hold him accountable still represents, I think, a very healthy location of the whole power mechanism of government. that if you begin to too neatly and too tidily divide and too logically to divide power in Washington, we could very well develop a system in which nobody knew who was to blame. Thank you. I'm sure that that's a factor. Of course, no man sells himself to run anything, whether it's a university or a company or a nation, without a certain amount of salesmanship. This is in the nature of pushing oneself forward. I think our job is to develop sophistication about that. But I do think that, as I tried to indicate, that growing out of Newstadian theory, and not entirely blamable on him, we did become too rhapsodic about the power of the presidency, and it needs to be coolly reappraised. Yes?
Here, I wonder if we turn to the general subject of making foreign policy and refer back to your comments about sub-governments and so on. Robert Engler has written extensively about the role of the oil interests in sort of forming a sub-government in Middle Eastern policy. There's been some suggestion that Lyndon Johnson took over the presidency from Kennedy, that he was closer to these corporate business interests, for example, in his policies in the Caribbean and so on. I wonder if you could comment on the extent to which you see this as a problem. Secondly, how, in fact, does, if it does, this kind of business interest make itself felt directly on the office of the presidency?
Well, I really don't have anything in that area of pertinent to observe. I did not ever get involved in areas of policy that affected oil or the Middle East. So I don't have any insights on how it was felt in the White House. I think
How about in the Dominican Republic situation? There's been some debate as to whether or not there was just a mass confusion which sent the troops in, or whether it was a question of pressures on the presidency and so on.
Well, there again, I should have qualified at the beginning, or at least Dr. Kerr should have qualified, that my experience was pretty totally in the domestic area. And as you question, I'm trying to think whether I recall anything in the Dominican crisis. I would not be inclined to believe that that it was that there was any substantial feed in at the time of the crisis from oil or any other commercial interests that played. Now, obviously, we can oversimplify how interests are felt in a crisis time. They set the climate on which we then leaders examine a crisis, and obviously they do play a substantial role. I've not seen any really good analysis of exactly how that works. I think we tend to oversimplify interest group role in government. I was never aware in any area in which I dealt that an interest group had a direct and immediate effect on a president, on the president I served. That in fact any effort to do that would have to be to have a reverse effect, that he would be offended by having an interest group try to reach him too directly. But at the same time, in any area, you are constantly aware that a president can work within certain limited variables. In examining the whole civil aviation field, for example, that there are forces there that a president knows, and I have heard the president say this, that some of them have swifter and more certain communication with the public and the interested publics on their than he does, that they can reach publics faster than he can. We talk about public opinion, by the way, and this becomes a rather confusing term. What counts are how much publics care about an issue. And this is what a president is having when he looks at wanting to change a situation. He has to examine what are the publics that are concerned, who do they influence, and how much can I counter their influence or marshal their influence to support me. Yes?
I'm curious, for example, in the case of Nixon, when he awarded charters to, I think it was Eastern Airline, as opposed to others that were on the West Coast.
No.
I have the impression there that in some way there was relationships where he favored Houston over those on the West Coast. How do you explain this?
I think that's really, I was not aware of it while I was in the White House, but after I got out and Nixon reversed the Johnson administration decisions on several of those charters, I was shocked to realize that a president was directly involved in that. And I don't know the history. I've been meaning to look into that area more. What has been the history in which a president himself, rather than a regulatory body, makes the final decision? Because to me, this is very corruptive of presidential power to have him involved in a specific award that means profit or loss to individual companies. The gentleman about to leave.
I know you didn't refer to the invisible government, the book that's been read so frequently, in reference to the CIA.
Yeah.
Now, the YouTube incident becomes very imperative for some relationship in reference to government policy and action from the president. And also when Kennedy was president, there was a division of the CIA in Vietnam. There was a percentage were with his variation of change, and the other was against him, and there was somewhat of a conflict. Now, these forces worked beyond his initiative, beyond the president's initiative. Have you anything to say about this?
Well, I do not know all the areas, and I have not read, I've read that, but it was many years ago, The Invisible Government. I'm not aware of areas in which a president has not had a reasonable degree of control over the major operations of CIA. I'm certain that individual agents have the capacity to do things that are beyond that, and that there again is in other areas. It's possible to hypothecate a rather terrifying picture of what an invisible government like that, the predicaments it can get you into. I did have a number of dealings with the CIA in the course of my own activities, and I have the highest respect for the man who now heads it, Richard Helms. I might just give one experience because it at least poses an insight into the problems of government. I was there one day when the president of the National Student Association phoned and asked if he could come see me, and he did, came on over that afternoon, and he said that Ramparts magazine was coming out the next week with an article saying that the NSA was receiving money from CIA. And I said, well, is it true? And he said, yes. Well, I said, well, you sure waited a long time to come see me about this problem, because if it's coming out next week, there's not a great deal that can be done about it. But we did move immediately. The president immediately called on the Undersecretary of State together with John Gardner and the head of CIA to report to him on this and to make recommendations. They came in shortly with a proposal to terminate the kind of subsidy that was being carried out, and they proposed that a presidential commission explore alternative methods of assisting voluntary organizations in this country to play a role in international affairs. I sat in on the commission that was set up after that, and it really was a fascinating problem, because obviously it was deeply wrong for the CIA to have gotten involved in this. Yet, as best we could ever determine, and I knew the people on both in the NSA and in the CIA who ran this program, this was about the most unfettered money that the government ever spends, partly because it was secret. There was no quid pro quo demanded of the NSA in giving it that money. It evolved because of a feeling that there was great need in the student community of the world, for example, for American student organizations to participate. And the NSA was the leading student organization. And NSA and the CIA was the only agency that had any unfettered money. State Department couldn't do it, didn't have any funds. So it was a mixed story, even though it was essentially wrong and it needed to be terminated. But the sad sequel to that is that despite a great deal of study that was given by a presidential commission, we have never figured out any alternative way of doing this. And as a result, the role of voluntary American organizations is much diminished today. And most other countries do find ways of supporting their student organizations and their labor organizations and others in international affairs. Yes?
For many years, it would seem that local and state governments have deferred to Washington for creativity and imagination, with exceptions, of course, in programs of trying to deal with the major issues that you were alluding to before. From your viewpoint, your perspective in Washington, do you see a meaningful role for local and state government in the next few decades ahead? Or are these gradually going to sink?
Well, first of all, there really hasn't been that much diminution of role. And if you look at the dollars spent and the personnel employed, if you look at almost any indice of activities, state and local government has expanded enormously over the years. But the fact is that there are two primary reasons why the federal government cannot just sit back and say, let state and local government do it. One is that the federal government has got the best revenue-raising capacity, and in many ways the most equitable. Secondly, most of these problems we're talking about now just don't neatly confine themselves to state and local boundaries. And so the federal government is just, Eisenhower used to talk about this, but was never able to effectively formulate any way to redelegate functions and roles back to state and local government. Yes?
In Look magazine several years ago, there was an article on Waldorf and Rostow, in which it was said that he was the chief architect of our Vietnam policy. Do you have any opinion on that?
Walt Rostow?
Yes.
I didn't see that article, but I think he's become the convenient scapegoat. I think he certainly supported the policy in Vietnam, but he was rather late in coming to the White House. He was, for most of the years in which our involvement really developed, he was over in the State Department, and he was not a key figure. Now, his thinking was, but the thinking that sustained our involvement in Vietnam, there are many people in and out of government that can claim to be architects of that, although most of them no longer claim that. But the great illusion that we had in which Kennedy came back in office is that we needed to have the capacity to deal in limited actions in the parts of the world before the trouble got out of bounds, and we did, and that's what happened. Yes.
Wouldn't more power be allocated to the vice president rather than being chair of the board for the president?
I don't believe so. No, I think the minute you and I'm not picking the particular incumbent to make that judgment about, but the minute you go beyond having a vice president do only what the president asks him to, you have created a power schism at the top of government that could really be quite dangerous. The nation really doesn't elect the vice president. He is the chosen running mate of the president, and he can be very useful to handle delegated functions, but certainly not beyond that, in my opinion. Yes?
Peter, I wonder if you could comment on the recent television broadcast of President Johnson, particularly the first week he told us that he didn't want to, he never wanted to be president. The second week, he gave a picture really of a very anguished, tortured, bitter, and sort of retrospectively helpless man faced with, well, I don't know if helpless is the right word, but faced with these kinds of...
Frustrated.
All right, frustrated. Was this your impression working close to him?
No, I think, and I'm very happy that it was so that he, if he shared torment about filling or continuing to fill the office of the presidency, he did not share that with us, and I think it would have been a very demoralizing thing if he did. I happen to feel that even out of office, a president needs to keep those feelings to himself, that it doesn't do anybody any good, and therefore I was not particularly cheered by the first broadcast, and I was even less cheered by the second one, because in that one I think the appropriate public interest would have been for him to spell out why he decided to go into Vietnam, why he decided to do why he changed his mind if he did, and kept it exclusively on himself, because he was the only important decision maker. Whether it was Clark Clifford or Dean Russ that said such and such on March 4th is entirely immaterial to his interest, and in a sense he got down into the cat barrel and trying to fight out on who did what to whom on March 4th, and that's just not appropriate presidential role. Yes?
You sketched to say a couple of things about the sub-government education. One, that was my year.
Well, when Johnson came into office, I wouldn't say it was much of a sub-government. Education had been a sub-government which managed to consistently castrate itself over the years. It was a self-defeating sub-government, if it was anything, and there had really been no substantial federal development in federal role in the education field, and it was with the support of, or the presidential energizing role that I was talking about earlier that permitted the enormous breakthrough in the education field. Well, now education is in a curious limbo, and I'm doing a study on this and hope to write a book about it. But there's diminished leadership from the executive, and particularly from the president, and it's in danger of, it's shown this summer and this fall, and is indeed in the process of showing right now, that it's developed a fair degree of muscle, that it was able to override the president's budget on the floor of the House and then again in the Senate, and didn't have quite enough muscle to override his veto, but it's challenging him again on the new appropriation bill, and so we're probably going to end up the fiscal year without ever formally appropriated any money for education, which will be an ironic situation. I'm not altogether sanguine about this, because I think that what will emerge out of this sort of a bloody power struggle in the sub-government of education will be the dominance of some of the more traditional vested interests, that the Impacted Areas Program, vocational education program, a number of those that have developed tremendous muscles will get theirs, but that a number of other programs which if you were having a really rational ordering of priorities in the education field, would do better, may get shoved out of the picture. Yes?
You just briefly mentioned something about political parties, that the Congress and the President are from different parties now. How would you put the party system into this structure of government that you had outlined?
Well, the role of party today is a sort of an imprecise one. In some areas it plays party loyalty plays a more substantial role than other. I don't have any really neat or original ideas about how to define the future role of party in Washington. I think the Democratic Party is going through the valley of the shadow of death right now. And where they should fear no evil, I don't know. I think it needs to fear a lot of evil. But whether we're going to continue with a dominant two-party system of government is I would say, still rather uncertain. I don't think the Republican Party, it's always been a minority party, which when it profits mainly on the national level off of the failures of the Democrats. But now I'm getting slightly partisan. Yes?
In 1968, Continental was awarded certain flight lines to the South Pacific, and I was wondering what elements came into this decision and why was it subsequently overturned?
I just can't give you an answer to that. I was not aware of the awarding nor the reversing, other than what I read in the newspapers. I don't know how a president sits down and decides on specific airlines and their routes. As I say, I think it's a bizarre function to locate in the presidency. I would certainly like to see it transferred somewhere else. I'm sure it's going to lead to all kinds of pulling and tugging no matter where it's located, but it's just it's really not appropriate to his concerns, it seems to me, and it diminishes his role.
Well, do you think that these, connections with the airlines, do they have a more or less direct pipeline to the president in this particular decision? Would they influence him?
The more precise you get, I can only say the more I don't know. If I wasn't aware that they had a role there in the White House, I certainly wouldn't know how they were exercising it. You can work in the White House, and there are areas in which you just you might as well be somewhere else as far as having a real inside know about how things operate. I did have work in the communications field. I helped set up the presidential task force that was to re-examine the whole federal role in communication. And there you became aware that there are major forces in struggle in Washington that all have vested interests in communication policy. And I was aware of efforts by some of those forces through chosen spokesmen to try to discredit the task force with the president even before the task force had been able to reach its conclusions. And I felt this was a rather dastardly thing. They were not trying to affect policy so much as they were trying to frustrate policy making. And this does go on, yes. Yes?
One of the things that the Johnson administration received continuous criticism for was the so-called credibility gap. And
I knew that question hadn't come up.
it disturbs me because I was in Thailand for much of the time. Vietnam was holding up. And you raised the question before as to whether Congress should have a more prominent role in formulating foreign policy. But throughout this time, we have seen that Congress has often been deliberately that the presidency, the office of presidency, the institution, the whole executive branch, would have a much stronger, should have a much greater moral responsibility to inform the senators so that they don't have to make misinformed statements, as they constantly make about countries like China. Perhaps you have some suggestions, some ideas of growth.
Well, I don't think that the misinformed statement